The storm hit faster than they expected. The winds howled, and the sky turned a deep crimson, flashing with lightning that cut through the dark clouds. The human survey team had been stationed on the Red Plains for weeks, mapping out the uncharted landscape of this alien world. They were used to the dust storms, the cold nights, and the occasional encounter with the local wildlife, but nothing like this. The wind whipped through the tents and made the ground tremble beneath their boots. Everyone rushed to secure their equipment and take cover, but it wasn't the storm itself that drew attention. It was the figure, stumbling through the swirling sand, half hidden by the dust. At first, they thought it was just another mirage, an illusion caused by the heat and wind. But then it fell, collapsing into the dust. James Calloway, the leader of the survey team, was the first to see it. A figure that didn't belong. It was an alien woman, unlike anything they had encountered before. Her body was slender, her skin shimmering with a soft violet hue, as if it were part of the sky itself. She had long, flowing hair that clung to her face like wet strands of silver. Her clothes were foreign, made of materials they couldn't even begin to identify. She was barely conscious, her breath shallow and her movements weak. James didn't hesitate. His instincts kicked in. He dropped the equipment he had been securing and sprinted toward her. The storm raged around him, sand and debris stinging his skin, but he ignored it. Kneeling beside her, he lifted her gently, feeling the strange coolness of her skin against his. He had no idea where she had come from, but he couldn't leave her out there to die. The storm would swallow her whole if he didn't act quickly. With effort, he carried her toward the shelter of his tent, the other members of the team staring at him with confusion and uncertainty. They had been trained to be cautious in these situations, to protect themselves from unknown threats. But James was different. He believed in doing the right thing, even if it meant risking his own life. Inside the tent, he laid her down on the cot. The wind howled outside, rattling the canvas. But in the tent, it was calm. James knelt beside her, examining her more closely. Her breathing was still shallow, but she wasn't unconscious anymore. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing a pair of bright, glowing irises, like two moons in a dark sky. She looked at him, confusion and fear clouding her expression. Where? Her voice was weak, barely a whisper. James leaned closer, trying to understand her words. "You're safe," he said, his voice steady.
"The storm is bad out there, you're in my tent." She blinked, trying to process his words.
Her gaze shifted from him to the tent walls, as if seeing it for the first time. Then she looked back at him, her expression still unreadable. "Why?" Her voice trembled now, a mix of exhaustion and confusion. "Why did you help me?" James hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure how to explain it. There was no grand reason, no deep logic behind it. He didn't help her because she was alien, or because he had a mission to complete. He helped her because she needed it. "You were in danger," he replied simply. "I couldn't leave you out there." Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to understand him. James could feel the tension in the air. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was building between them. The questions were already swirling in his mind. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why had she been out there alone in the middle of such a violent storm? But he didn't ask those questions. Not yet. Instead, he reached into his supplies, grabbing a blanket and offering it to her. She took it without a word, wrapping herself in it as her eyes never left him. It was strange, being in such close proximity to someone so different. Her presence felt foreign, almost ethereal, like she didn't quite belong in this world. James sat down on the other side of the tent, keeping his distance. He didn't want to overwhelm her, especially not when she was clearly in a vulnerable state. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the occasional gust of wind that rattled the tent. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, the world felt still. There was a certain weight to the moment, a sense of quiet connection. James didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know who this woman was or why she had crossed his path, but one thing was clear. Things had changed. Nothing would ever be the same after this. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a strange calm. The winds had died down, and the sky was clearing, revealing the distant, barren hills of the Red Plains. The team members began to emerge from their tents, stretching and blinking against the bright light. But it didn't take long for the whispers to start. James stood at the entrance of his tent, watching the others. He didn't care what they said. He knew that some of them would question his decision to bring her in, to help her. They would wonder why he hadn't followed protocol, why he hadn't just left her to fend for herself. But he didn't care. What mattered was that he had done the right thing. He glanced back inside the tent. The alien woman was still there, resting quietly. She hadn't said much since the night before, but she seemed to be recovering. James didn't know what the future held, but he had a feeling that this encounter would lead to something far bigger than he could imagine. The rumors would spread quickly, of course. That was inevitable. In a place like this, where isolation was the norm, gossip was the currency of the camp. But James wasn't concerned with that. He wasn't concerned with the judgment of others. What mattered now was that he had chosen to help. And in the end, that would speak louder than any rumor. The morning light broke through the thin fabric of the tent, casting faint rays of warmth on the dusty floor. The storm had passed, and the world outside seemed calm, almost peaceful. James stood at the entrance of the tent, taking in the quiet landscape of the Red Plains. The horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, with rocky outcrops and dry earth as far as the eye could see. It was beautiful in its own harsh way, a place that both challenged and fascinated those who came here. But the tranquility was fleeting. Behind him, the low murmur of voices began to rise. The rest of the team had started to gather, their curiosity piqued by what had happened during the night. James could hear them whispering, their words laced with suspicion and uncertainty. The strange alien woman he had brought into his tent had become the talk of the camp. It was inevitable. James knew what they would say. He had always been a quiet leader, one who focused on the task at hand and kept a low profile. But this was different. He had made a choice that none of them would understand, and the rumors would start to spread, as they always did. As the voices grew louder, he turned back into the tent, where the alien woman was still resting on the cot. She had barely moved since he had carried her in the night before. Her breathing was steady now, a sign that the worst of the storm and the shock had passed. Her skin still had that strange violet glow, and her long silver hair lay around her like a halo. She looked peaceful, almost ethereal in the dim light. James took a step closer to her, careful not to disturb her. He hadn't spoken to her much since bringing her inside, other than offering her water and making sure she was comfortable. She had been exhausted, her body clearly drained from the storm, and whatever ordeal had led her to be out there in the first place. She hadn't even asked for anything, just silently accepted what he offered, as though she had learned long ago not to expect much from anyone. For a moment, James found himself wondering about her. Who was she? What was she doing on this barren world, so far from any known settlement? And why had she been caught out in the storm, alone and vulnerable? The questions were there, just below the surface, but he didn't press her for answers. Not yet. He had no right to. The camp outside was growing more active, and it wouldn't be long before someone came looking for answers. He could hear footsteps approaching, heavy and deliberate. James braced himself, straightening his posture and trying to ignore the knot forming in his stomach. He had no idea what to say to them, no idea how to explain himself. He had acted on instinct, and that was something no one would understand. The flap of the tent opened, and one of the team members stepped inside. It was Alan, the lead engineer, who had always been the first to speak his mind. Alan's eyes immediately fell on the alien woman, and the tension in his face was palpable. He wasn't one for subtlety, and he had a habit of speaking before he thought. "James," Alan said, his voice low but firm. "What in the hell is going on here?" James turned to face him, his jaw tightening. "She's fine," he said simply. not offering any more explanation than that. He didn't need to. Alan's eyes flickered between James and the woman on the cot. His suspicion was evident, but James refused to let it show. He wasn't going to explain himself to anyone, not yet anyway. The decision had been made, and there was nothing to be gained by second-guessing it now. "She's alien, James. What were you thinking?" Alan pressed. "This could cause trouble."
You know the rules?
"Bringing someone like her into camp, it's a breach of protocol. You've put us all at risk." James took a deep breath, feeling the familiar frustration building. He wasn't a man of many words, and Alan's bluntness only made things harder. He could feel the weight of the others' eyes on him, even though they weren't here yet. The whispers were starting to gather momentum, and he knew they would only grow louder with each passing minute. "I did what I had to do," James replied, his voice steady. "She was out there in the storm. She needed help, and I wasn't going to leave her to die." Alan stared at him, his eyes narrowing. "And what if she's a threat? What if she's here to spy on us? Or worse? We can't just take in every stranger we come across." James shook his head, the anger rising in his chest. "She's not a threat. She's just a person who needed help. That's all." But Alan didn't seem convinced. "You're playing a dangerous game, James," he muttered. "And now we've got an alien in our camp, and it's going to look bad. Real bad." Before James could respond, the flap of the tent opened again, and two more of the crew members entered. Sarah, the team medic, and Josh, the communications officer. They didn't say anything at first, their eyes focused on the alien woman. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice calm, but laced with curiosity. "You brought her inside," Sarah said softly. "Why?" James sighed, his patience thinning.
"Because she was dying out there. She couldn't survive another minute in that storm." Josh stepped closer, his eyes flicking between the woman and James.
"And you just helped her because it was the right thing to do?" he asked, a hint of disbelief in his tone. "No questions? No concerns about what she might be? About what she might want?" James met his gaze, his voice unwavering. "Sometimes you just do the right thing. No matter who they are, no matter what they look like." She was in trouble, and I couldn't walk away from that. The room fell silent, and James felt the weight of the moment settle in. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with the consequences. He had no idea what the others would think, what they would do. But he couldn't take it back. He had helped her because it was what he believed in. And no matter how much they questioned him, no matter how much they criticized his actions, he would never regret it. The alien woman shifted on the cot, her violet eyes blinking open slowly. She looked at James first, then at the others, her gaze steady and calm. She didn't speak right away, but the silence in the room was heavy with meaning. She wasn't afraid, not of them, and not of the situation she had found herself in. She seemed resigned, as though she had already accepted whatever would happen next. "I'm not here to harm anyone," she said quietly, her voice low but clear. "I never was." James didn't know what to say to that. The others were still processing her words, trying to understand what she meant. Sarah stepped forward, her expression softening. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked gently. The woman shook her head, her silver hair glinting in the light. "No, I'm far from home." There was a pause, the weight of her words hanging in the air. James could see that the others were beginning to shift in their thinking. The tension wasn't gone, but it had lessened. They were starting to realize that perhaps this was not just some random encounter. There was something more to this, something bigger than they had anticipated. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, Alan let out a breath, his stance relaxing a little. "Well, we've got a lot to figure out," he muttered. "But for now, I guess we'll have to make do." James nodded, relief flooding through him. The hard part was over, for now. But he knew this was just the beginning. The rumors would continue to spread, and things would only get more complicated from here. He couldn't predict how it would all play out. But one thing was certain. His life, and the lives of everyone in the camp, were about to change. The morning was a quiet one, as the camp slowly came to life under the pale light of the twin suns. The alien woman had retreated to the far corner of the tent, curled up with the blanket James had given her. She hadn't spoken much, but her presence was undeniable, a strange yet calming force among the chaos that had followed her arrival. James knew the questions were coming, and he didn't want to face them. The crew had gathered outside, and he could already hear their voices rising, growing louder, as they debated what to do next. He couldn't blame them. They were scared of the unknown, scared of what this sudden encounter meant for their mission, and scared of how this might affect their standing with their superiors. Still, he couldn't bring himself to feel regret. When he had helped her the night before, he had acted on instinct. It was what any decent person would do. She had been alone, stranded in a deadly storm, and he had brought her in. What was so hard to understand about that? But now that the storm had passed and the reality of their situation began to settle in, James knew he would have to answer for his actions. The crew was restless, and no matter how much he wanted to avoid conflict, the questions were inevitable. He stood up from his cot and walked over to the small stove in the corner, using the time to gather his thoughts. The smell of coffee began to fill the tent, a small comfort in the midst of the tension that hung in the air. As he poured a mug for himself, the flap of the tent opened, and Alan stepped inside, his expression grim. "James," Alan said, his voice low. "We need to talk." James took a deep breath and turned to face him.
"About what?" "The woman," Alan replied, his eyes glancing toward the corner where she was resting. "You can't just keep her here."
"The camp's getting nervous. People are talking, and they're not happy about it." James set the mug down and crossed his arms. "She's not a threat," he said firmly, though the weight of Alan's words hung heavily on him. "She's not here to harm anyone." Alan raised an eyebrow. "And how do you know that?" "You don't even know who she is, where she's from, or what her intentions are. For all we know, she could be a scout for an enemy faction." "We've seen stories like this before, James. People get too trusting, and it leads to disaster." James felt a tightness in his chest. He didn't want to argue. He didn't want to fight. But he couldn't let Alan, nor anyone else, accuse him of something he didn't believe in. "I didn't bring her here out of trust or fear," he said quietly. "I brought her here because she needed help." "That's it." Alan stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to measure the sincerity in his words. Finally, he sighed and lowered his gaze. "I get it," he muttered. "But I still think it was a bad call." James didn't respond. Instead, he turned toward the tent flap. He could hear the faint murmur of voices outside, the crew members arguing among themselves. It was only a matter of time before this situation blew up in their faces. "You're going to have to tell them," Alan said, breaking the silence. "You can't just keep her hidden in here forever." James nodded. He knew Alan was right. The longer this went on, the harder it would be to control the situation. The crew would want answers, and he couldn't keep shielding her forever. He wasn't afraid of the questions. They would come whether he was ready or not. But the thought of exposing her, of putting her at the center of this mess, made him uneasy.
"I'll talk to them," James said finally. "But I'm not kicking her out."
"She's not a danger." Alan opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak there was a soft noise from the corner of the tent. James turned, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw the alien woman slowly sit up. She had been quiet for most of the morning, but now she was awake, her eyes clear and focused. She looked at James, then at Alan, her expression unreadable. "I can speak for myself," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the circumstances. "I don't need anyone to defend me." James felt a surge of relief. At least now, They wouldn't have to argue her case for her. The alien woman stood up from the cot and walked toward them with measured steps. Her skin shimmered faintly in the light, and her eyes, those strange, luminous eyes, were fixed on Alan. "I understand your concerns," she said calmly. "You don't know me, and I don't know you. But I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because I had nowhere else to go. I didn't choose this." Alan didn't respond immediately. He just watched her closely, as though trying to figure out whether to believe her. James could see the hesitation in Alan's eyes, the part of him that still wasn't ready to trust someone he couldn't understand.
I don't know who you are, Alan finally said, his voice low. I don't know what you want.
But right now, you're in our camp. And that means you need to answer some questions.
The alien woman nodded, her expression still calm.
I don't mind answering your questions, but you should know that I have no interest in your world.
I've been stranded here, lost, and I was trying to survive. My people, they're far away, and I don't know when or if I will ever see them again. James noticed the sadness in her eyes, something raw and vulnerable that she hadn't shown before. He could hear the weight in her words, the loneliness, the fear of being alone on this strange planet with no one to turn to. He couldn't help but feel a little guilty, even though he had done what he thought was right. "I don't want any trouble," she continued, her voice softer now. "But I need your help, just until I can figure out a way to survive. I'm not asking for anything more." James saw Alan soften slightly at her words, though the skepticism was still there. Alan didn't trust her, and maybe he never would. But for now, there was a fragile truce between them. "Fine," Alan said gruffly, "but you're not staying here without some kind of answer. The others won't accept it. We need to know where you came from, what you're really doing here." The alien woman nodded, accepting his terms. "I understand, but I have no answers to give. I only know that I was caught in the storm, and I had nowhere else to go." James didn't speak. He could feel the eyes of the rest of the crew outside, waiting for answers. He knew that this wouldn't be an easy conversation, but he also knew something else. This was only the beginning. As Alan stepped out of the tent, James turned back to the alien woman, who was now standing in the middle of the tent, her hands folded in front of her. She seemed smaller now, vulnerable in a way she hadn't been before. For the first time, James saw the weight of her journey. She wasn't just some mystery to solve. She was a person, stranded in an alien world just like they were. He met her gaze and nodded. "I'll help you," he said, though he didn't know what that would look like. "We'll figure this out. Together." The alien woman didn't speak. Instead, she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, as though she understood him perfectly. She didn't need him to solve her problems, but in that moment, he realized that perhaps, just perhaps, they were both looking for something, a way to survive, and maybe even a way to make sense of the strange, unpredictable world they were in. The day was long, stretching under the heat of the twin suns. The crew moved quietly around the camp, the tension between them thicker than before. Whispers floated through the air, bouncing off the walls of the tents, mixing with the hum of machinery and the crackle of radios. They were a team, a unit that had always functioned well together. But now, things were different. Now, there was a shadow in the camp, an unknown that they weren't sure how to handle. James had tried to keep to his routine, to focus on the mission. But every time he stepped outside, his eyes would be drawn to the woman in his tent. She had barely moved since their conversation the day before. She was quiet, withdrawn, and yet there was an energy around her, something that made him uneasy, like he was standing on the edge of something far bigger than he could understand. He spent the morning working with the rest of the crew, setting up the scanning equipment they would need to continue their survey of the planet. The desert landscape stretched out in every direction, flat and lifeless, but it held secrets. He was sure of that. They had come to map, to explore, to learn. But now, the only thing he could focus on was the alien woman in his tent, the one who had changed everything. By midday, the heat had become unbearable, and most of the crew retreated to their tents to rest. James had been avoiding the question of what to do next. He didn't want to make decisions for the team. But the longer he waited, the harder it became. They were a long way from any kind of civilization, stranded in the middle of nowhere, with an alien woman in their midst. He returned to his tent, hoping for some solitude. But when he stepped inside, he found her sitting on the cot, looking out at the camp through the open flap. She hadn't moved from this spot for hours, and yet she was more alert than ever, her eyes flickering between the camp and the horizon beyond. James couldn't tell if she was watching for something, or just lost in thought. She turned toward him as he entered, her expression unreadable. For a moment, they just looked at each other, as if waiting for something to be said, something to break the silence. But neither of them spoke. Instead, James walked over to the small table in the corner, his back to her, trying to shake off the tension that had been building ever since she arrived. "It's strange," she said suddenly, her voice quiet but clear. "I don't know why I'm here. I don't know why you're helping me." James paused, the words catching him off guard. He hadn't expected her to speak, not like this. For a moment, he didn't answer. He wasn't sure what to say. His help had been instinctive. She needed it, and he gave it. It wasn't anything more complicated than that. Or at least, that's what he had told himself. "I couldn't leave you out there," he finally replied, his voice soft. "The storm would have killed you." She nodded slowly, as if understanding something that he hadn't fully grasped yet. Her violet eyes seemed to pierce through him, reading him in a way that made him uncomfortable. It wasn't just that she was different. It was the way she made him feel, as if there was a part of him she understood that he didn't even know about. "I'm not asking you to explain," she said, her voice more steady now. "But you need to know that I'm not just anyone." "I'm not like you." James shifted uncomfortably. He had always known that. She was an alien, and that alone made her different. But there was something more to her words, something unspoken. It lingered in the air between them, a weight that neither of them was ready to lift. "I know," he said quietly, his gaze meeting hers. She stood then, moving with a fluid grace that made her seem almost otherworldly. The way she moved, the way her skin shimmered in the light, it was like watching something from a dream. It made him feel grounded, as if he were somehow more connected to the world around him, just by being near her. "I'm not here by choice," she said, her voice softer now. "I was sent here, stranded, by forces I don't understand. My people, they're far away, and I don't know how to get back." James took a step closer, the air between them charged with a quiet tension. Her words were a puzzle, one that he couldn't quite solve. She wasn't just some random traveler. She was someone who had been sent here, someone who had a purpose. And whatever that purpose was, it was connected to the storm, to the planet, to him. "Where do you need to go?" he asked, his voice tentative. "We can help you find a way. We've got equipment, and we're equipped to make long-range transmissions. If you can communicate with your people." "No," she interrupted, her voice sharper now, a flicker of panic in her eyes. "It's not that simple. If I try to reach them, if I signal them, it could make things worse. There are dangers. Dangers I don't even fully understand." James frowned, confused. "What kind of dangers?" She hesitated, her gaze turning inward, as if searching for the right words. "The kind that follow me," she said quietly. "The kind that will destroy everything if they find me." He took a step back, the reality of her words settling in. The storm, the confusion, the way everything had changed so quickly. It wasn't just a matter of survival now. There were forces at play, things James couldn't even begin to understand, and they were much bigger than his team, bigger than this camp. "You're not just stranded here," he said, his voice low. You're running from something. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she crossed the room and stood by the tent flap, looking out at the landscape. The desert stretched for miles, empty and desolate. But to her, it might have been more than just a barren landscape. It was a place to hide, a place to disappear. James could see that now. I didn't want to be here, she said after a long silence, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to be anywhere but home. James watched her, feeling a pang of sympathy for her. She wasn't like the others he had met, the ones who came to explore, to conquer, to build. She wasn't here for any of that. She was just a person, stranded, trying to survive. You're safe here, he said, trying to reassure, at least for now. She didn't look at him. Instead, her gaze seemed lost, distant, as though she were somewhere far beyond the tent, far beyond the camp. She was thinking of home, thinking of the journey that had brought her here. She was thinking of things he could never understand. Safe, she murmured.
I'm not sure what that means anymore.
James didn't know what to say to that. All he knew was that whatever this was, whatever had brought them together, it was just the beginning, and it would take all of them, his team, the crew, and her, to survive what was coming next. The quiet stretched between them, but this time, the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was a moment of understanding, of two strangers recognizing the weight of their shared existence. She wasn't just an alien. She wasn't just a puzzle to solve. She was someone who had crossed paths with him, someone who needed help, just like anyone else.
I'm here, James said, his voice steady. We'll figure this out.
She turned then, her gaze softening just a little.
Thank you. The words hung in the air between them, simple but heavy with meaning.
It wasn't a promise, it wasn't a solution, but it was something they both needed to hear. It was the beginning of trust, even if they both knew it wasn't enough. I'll stay here, she said quietly, her voice barely audible. For now. And in that moment, James realized that no matter what happened, no matter what they faced in the coming days, he wouldn't leave her alone. He couldn't. The unknown stretched out before them, but for the first time since the storm had come, James felt a strange sense of peace. They were both trapped here, in the same place, at the mercy of forces neither of them fully understood. But for now, that didn't matter.
They would figure it out together,